Hey there, TBD listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, SAP. Is your business reaching an exciting turning point? Are you ready to seize the moment for growth? Well, when you're facing tough decisions, SAP can help you be ready for anything that happens next. To learn more, head to sap.com/be-ready. And stick around to hear how the president of an esports league seized the moment. Apple Card is the perfect credit card for every purchase. It has cashback rewards unlike others. You earn unlimited daily cashback on every purchase, receive it daily, and can grow it at 4.15% annual percentage yield when you open a high-yield savings account. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone and start earning and growing your daily cash with savings today. Apple Card subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility requirements. Savings accounts provided by Goldman Sachs Bank USA. Member FDIC. Terms apply. When Apoorva Mandavilli wanted to write about ventilation in schools, she knew exactly where to start. A music room. A place where people are packed together, breathing the same air, singing loudly. So she went to see Keith Oxman, a music teacher at East High School in Denver.
He has been at the school for a very long time. He's in his mid-60s, and he's the oldest staff member there. He's nominated for a Grammy, and he's just a very cool person.
Apoorva covers science and health for the New York Times, which for the past 3 years has meant mostly writing about COVID. As we know from your reporting and many other people's reporting, singing, music, particularly in poorly ventilated areas, is a way that COVID can spread easily. So what were Keith Oxman's concerns when he was faced with the COVID pandemic?
The reason I wanted to see the music room was precisely for the reasons you just mentioned, because music rooms are sort of ideal breeding grounds for the virus to thrive and spread. And Keith Oxman's music room is sort of a tight space. You know, it's a reasonably big music room, but the ceilings are very low. And there was a lot of equipment, and they had, a lot of stands and chairs, and the windows were closed, and sort of felt a little bit crowded in there. And he said, there are all these things you're supposed to do to make the risk lower, like open the windows, but the windows don't open.
It's hard to have fans on because then the sheet music starts flying around.
I don't know that he ever really got to a place where he felt very comfortable, because the ventilation in that room was never really improved.
I'm asking Apoorva these questions because it's not just music rooms. Kids are back to school, COVID is spiking again, and things like masks and testing are unfortunately fraught political issues. Improving ventilation seems like a no-brainer, something people can agree on. But here we are, more than 3 years after the start of the pandemic. How's the inside air quality these days?
Not great. We have a lot of very old schools in this country, and a lot of schools that are so old that you can't actually modernize their ventilation systems. And a lot of schools haven't even really thought about it. They have so many other things to worry about. And so what you have is a situation where kids are going back to school with no, ventilation that's no better than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so already you're starting to see the results, right? Just last week, there were schools in southern Texas and Kentucky that had to close because there were so many students and staff that were sick with some kind of respiratory illness, which they said, COVID, flu, whatever, but probably COVID because it's too early for flu. There are some universities that are bringing back masking requirements, and they're doing all these other things, but I still see that the conversation is not really about air quality in the way that it needs to be.
So today on the show, we're going to have that conversation. What we need to do to make indoor air safer, why it hasn't been done, and how it could benefit us all. I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and SAP. How do you know when to seize the moment for growth? When your opportunity arrives, you need to be ready. From expanding into new markets to hiring, business leaders face so many tough decisions.
My name is Brendan Donahue, president of the NBA 2K League. The NBA 2K League is a professional esport run by the NBA and 2K, where we take 30 million people who play the game of NBA 2K and we find the best 125 in the world to compete in our league.
In March of 2020, the start of the pandemic spurred the league to take steps it never imagined. And with SAP tools, they knew they were ready.
We could have postponed our season, like a lot of other sports leagues did. We decided to seize the moment. We created a competition that could be done virtually. We had the NBA 2K League on major sports networks for 17 weeks. That moment gave us a chance to talk to a mass audience across the world. So the majority of our fans, less than 1%, will ever step foot in an NBA arena to watch a game live. But you have this significant fandom and excitement for the game, and so that's really where we think we play a role. Our first season, we had 650,000 people watch our finals in season 1. Now our finals this past year, we had 2.2 million people watching.
NBA 2K League seized the moment for growth. Will you? Head to sap.com/be ready to learn more.
Apple Card is the perfect credit card for every purchase. It has cashback rewards unlike others. You earn unlimited daily cashback on every purchase, receive it daily, and can grow it at 4.15% annual percentage yield when you open a high-yield savings account. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone and start earning and growing your daily cash with savings today. Apple Card subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility requirements. Savings accounts provided by Goldman Sachs Bank USA. Member FDIC. Terms apply. I think to back up for someone who hasn't been thinking about this a lot and underline why this is so important, I wonder if you could introduce me to the average U.S. school building in 2020, 2019. How old was it? How well ventilated was it? How did the air move around?
The air didn't move around very much or very well because the average school building in 2020 was about 50 years old, and a lot of buildings with windows painted shut for various reasons. A lot of times it's because of these days things like gun violence, or in East High, the music room windows were closed in part because they didn't want students climbing up onto the roof. And so the average school building is old, decrepit, decaying, and in very poor condition. It's not really set up to be clean and providing, clean air to the students.
And how much, if at all, has that changed from that moment to 2023?
It has changed some. I don't want to paint a totally bleak picture here. I think that there are schools that have tried to do things. In a lot of cases, it's been something really low tech, like just opening their windows if possible. There are schools with plans to do more. And there are some schools that have done a lot, that have, really overhauled their ventilation systems. Those are fewer and far between. There are schools that never really still talk about any of this stuff at all. They don't even talk about COVID. And so you've got the whole range from schools in California that have done everything to schools in places like Iowa that have done nothing and don't want to.
It can be incredibly difficult to talk about COVID and schools without spiraling into second guessing and arguments about closures and remote learning. But what I wanted to find out from Apoorva is what the data said about ventilation. Specifically, what role ventilation, or lack thereof, might have played in COVID outbreaks in schools.
Yeah, the data on that is not as clear-cut as we would like, in part because, schools were sort of opening and closing, and not a lot of people were thinking about doing studies in the way that, you'd need to do them to get clear answers. But we do have some data points. The CDC did one study in schools in Georgia and found that schools that improved their ventilation saw something like a 40% drop in COVID cases. There was another study that came out of Italy that said the drop in cases was more like 70+%. So there is some indication that improvements to ventilation are helpful. And, I want to point out that it's not just helpful for COVID. Good air quality is good for lots of things. It's good for cognition, memory, focus, good health, not having your asthma get worse, just, all kinds of things that are important.
What kind of toll does it take on students if the air quality in a school is poor or just not what it could be?
Well, very directly, it has an effect on health. There are a lot of kids in the United States who have asthma, and that's another one that is worse in poorer parts of the country and poorer neighborhoods. And longer term, it also has an effect on cognition and memory. You can actually see drops in test scores. And we know, for example, that air pollution is terrible for young people, and air pollution is in fact tied to higher mortality. So there are just so many problems that arise from being exposed to air pollutants, from being exposed to high heat, from being exposed to pathogens.
Improved ventilation seems like such a no-brainer. Like, no matter where you stand on remote learning, whether schools opened too early, closed too early, all of those things, like, it just seems to make sense. And there was, in fact, a lot of money appropriated for this in federal funds. How much money was in the American Rescue Plan to do this kind of improved air quality work?
Altogether, there is about $200 billion that was allotted for all kinds of improvements to schools, and a lot of that could be used for ventilation if schools so desired. There were some things that they needed to pay attention to, like improvements in learning loss and things like that, but certainly the money could have been used for air quality. And there was also other money that was given to states and territories that could be funneled into ventilation improvements. So really, more money than has ever been available for this kind of work.
And yet there's a gap. Is that a standard kind of money has been appropriated but not allocated kind of gap that you sometimes see in politics? Or is it more complex than that?
It's more complex than that. I think the money, if people really wanted to use it, is there, but there's multiple problems along the way. So some school administrators don't know that the money is available. East High's principal, for example, had no idea. There are other people who know about it but don't know how to go about applying for it. Some of the schools I talked to that did the best were schools where, the parents were really heavily involved and knew how to navigate these systems and knew how to apply and get things done.
So that automatically favors richer districts.
Absolutely. And also schools with enough staff to worry about these things, to help the parents do those things, and then staff to maintain those improvements once you actually get the money and make the improvements. Access to resources. There's so many ways in which equity starts to play a role. And also schools to begin with, the ones that need the most help are the ones that are in the poorest areas. Urban schools where students are studying right next to highways and factories. They're the ones that need the biggest improvements in ventilation. And those schools are often sort of hardest pressed to make improvements because they have so many other things going on that they need to worry about.
You mentioned speaking with school leaders. What did they tell you about the process of even trying to get this funding?
A lot of them don't know what kind of money is available, how much is available, what they're actually supposed to do to get it. A lot of the information is also at the school district level, and school districts are the ones that have to make the decisions and help the schools. But across the board, what I kept hearing is just that they're also all overwhelmed. I think learning loss and students' mental health problems and gun violence, these are things that are really on the minds of school administrators and school district officials. Even though air quality is as important as it just isn't able to compete with all these other more urgent priorities that they all have.
When we come back, shouldn't someone, maybe the government, make this a priority?
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverage you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Trying to grab all the groceries in one trip? Oof, not how you would have done that. You know sometimes less is more. Like when you drive less and save with the USAA annual mileage discount. USAA. Get a quote today.
Hey, TBD listeners, it's Lizzie. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to support what we are doing here, the best way to do that is to join Slate Plus. It's Slate's membership program. You get all your Slate podcasts, including this one, ad-free, and all sorts of cool extra content on the Slate site. So just head on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. Again, that is slate.com/whatnextplus. Thanks. I wonder if this summer might move the needle at all. After all, you and I are both in New York. We had dramatically poor air quality this summer, air quality that a lot of cities around the world experience more normally than we do. And then this morning, as I was getting ready to talk to you, there was a post in a parents group that I'm a part of about school and being closed for extreme heat because there is no air conditioning. Do you think that this moment might move some parents and students themselves to start pushing for this?
I hope so. I think you're right in that there seems to be this sort of push overall because now the pressure is coming from multiple angles. Before, maybe it was only heat in, a couple of weeks of the summer or in August after schools began in a lot of the country. Or maybe it was just wildfire in very isolated parts of the country. Certainly nobody was thinking about respiratory diseases. But now we have flu, RSV, COVID on the respiratory disease front. And we have wildfires that are affecting not just a few parts of the country, but really the whole country and very frequently. And now we also have incredibly hot days for much longer stretches than we used to have. And so all of a sudden, there are many reasons to worry about what air quality looks like inside a school.
Your story did seem to note some tentative progress.
Tentative is a good word for it, I think, because it's they're baby steps. Because I think what really would bring about change is if you had a ventilation czar or an agency that really owned this issue and pushed for it, which we don't have at the moment. Nobody owns air quality. It's not OSHA's responsibility because OSHA only does workplace. It's not the EPA's responsibility because EPA does outdoor air and indoor air only in terms of certain specific chemicals, but not indoor air overall. It's not the CDC's responsibility because they don't make laws. So really, we have the CDC issuing recommendations, and we have professional organizations that come up with standards, but they're not enforceable by law. So there's not really any major push to change things. But this May, we did have the CDC come out with a recommendation that schools should aim for 5 air exchanges an hour. It means, the sort of equivalent of having all the air in the room replaced 5 times an hour.
Like being on an airplane.
Like being on an airplane, except airplanes are actually much better than that. They're really great. So there are some steps towards it, but honestly, unless we have laws that really force change, I'm not sure how much of this is going to, move, except on a volunteer basis, sporadic change here and there.
Okay, so if you are a parent or a student or you work in a school and you are listening to this or read your story and are freaking out, what are some solutions?
There are some really low-tech solutions that parents and staff of schools can adopt. The very first thing you can do is actually go out and get air filters. There are air filters that are relatively inexpensive that are great at cleaning the air. You might need some help, and there are some online tools that you can use to figure out how many you might need for a room of a particular size. There's also something called a Corsi-Rosenthal box, which is this really sort of MacGyvered invention that Richard Corsi, who's one of the experts that I talked to, he and another scientist came up with it. But there are schools across the country where parents sort of made them on their own. You just need box fans and tape and some other things, and those are really inexpensive. And so there are things that they can do. But if they want to sort of really step it up, I would say pressure your school districts to really make changes in the level of air quality, to overhaul HVAC systems in the school district. Pressure your school administrators to really take this matter seriously and to not just, shut down schools every time there's a heat wave or there's, a wildfire or anything else, but rather to really sort of look forward, look ahead, see the problems coming at us and get ready.
Is it possible to know, when you think about the sort of constellation of interventions, and I'm asking, I guess, from a COVID perspective first, what that might do for the level of respiratory diseases, airborne diseases like COVID inside a school?
One of the things that happened during the pandemic is that scientists really learned a lot about how a lot of respiratory viruses behave, not just the coronavirus. So it actually forced them to rethink how the flu spreads, how the common cold spreads, how other coronaviruses that cause common cold spread. And so it really created a paradigm shift in a way in scientific thinking. And I think if people paid attention to air quality, it would bring down the number of cases, not just of COVID, but of all of these other illnesses. I mean, we all know that when kids there's 2 kids in a classroom that have something, they all get it. And it's not because they're all touching each other all the time, although of course little kids do that. It's because these viruses spread by air. And even before the pandemic, there were schools that had to shut down because they had flu outbreaks. There's a sort of much bigger stake here that we just haven't thought about.
When so many things about, I don't know, how we communicate publicly and certainly around COVID feel dire, I wonder if the response to this story made you feel a little hopeful, like, oh, this is something that maybe could get done?
I'd like to say so, but again, I really think it has to come from the government. I think it has to be legal. I think it has to be enforceable standards and codes and laws and, agencies that are really taking ownership. I don't see this happening, especially in the schools that most need it, when it's just being left up to the students or the administrators on a volunteer basis.
Does the Biden administration show any interest in taking this on?
I will say, to give credit where credit is due, that the Biden administration has done more on this issue than most other administrations. They've actually talked about it. There was a webinar that was held by the Office of Science and Technology Policy where somebody actually just openly said COVID is airborne, and that word airborne itself is something that everyone tiptoes around in the government, especially with the CDC. And so that in itself is progress. They've held all these sort of helpful webinars to help schools go through whatever they need to go through to figure out what they need and ask for help. The Department of Education has done things. There are some steps towards doing things more clearly and sort of providing guidance like the CDC's new recommendations. But it's just a beginning. We need lots and lots more.
Apoorva Mandavilli, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Apoorva Mandavilli covers global health and science for the New York Times. And that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Patrick Fort and Evan Campbell. Our show is edited by Mia Armstrong-Lopez. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio for Slate. And TBD is part of the larger What Next family. We are also part of Future Tense, a partnership of Slate, Arizona State University, and New America. And if you like what we are doing here, the best way to support us is to subscribe to Slate Plus. Just head on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. All right, we'll be back with more episodes next week. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks for listening.